So let me try to talk a little bit about the American economic crisis as I see it, where it's going. It's a lot to do in 20 minutes, but I shall try. First, the context, the history, the background. The United States is a very peculiar example of capitalism. It's not the norm. It's the atypical version. And that had to do with the fact that we didn't grow our capitalism out of a feudal background, the way the Europeans did, or out of another kind of background. We are a peculiar society in which the indigenous population was ethnically cleansed, as you all know, when the Europeans arrived here, and established a peculiar kind of economic system here in a void, so to speak. They were refugees from Europe, and they wanted to do it, thank you, differently. And that produced in the United States a bizarre situation. A new kind of capitalism, quite successful, but it always had a problem from the beginning, from the time we became an independent nation. They always had one key problem in this economic capitalism. They had a labor shortage. They never had enough people. And this is crucial that you get this, because it's one of those many things about our economic history that tends to be overlooked in the school courses that you've all had. The Indian population, the Native American population, was unavailable because they were largely dead. And so they're not good to work. And that meant you had to bring people here. Now, we brought a certain number of Africans here against their will, by force, as you know, but the bulk of the population had to be brought over here by some lure. Whatever was pushing them out of Europe, they had to be brought by a lure. So successful was capitalism here, free land having been taken from the Native Americans, very fertile, lots of coastline, good climate, very successful capitalism. You never have enough workers. So you had to pay high wages. Here comes the big point. You had to pay good wages. You had to pay enough wages to make people endure the trauma of leaving the cultures they had come from, the families, the connections, the feelings, all of that, to take a risky voyage across a dangerous ocean to a country whose language they probably didn't speak, with uncertain prospects for a job or any other way of survival. That's a lot of risk. There better be an inducement for that risk. And the inducement was high wages. Higher wages than were paid wherever these people came from. And not only did you have to pay higher wages to get them here, you had to pay higher wages once they got here to keep them. Why? Again, free land. If a worker in New York or Philadelphia or Boston wasn't happy, he or she could get relatively free land 100, 200, 400 miles west. Employers discovered they not only had to offer good wages to get the workers to come to the United States, they had to pay high wages, continuously rising, to keep them. Hence the following stunning statistic about the United States. From 1820 to 1970, 150 years, real wages, that is the amount of money paid for the average American worker for an hour, adjusted for the prices he or she had to pay, so it measures how much stuff you could actually buy, went up every decade for 150 years, rising real wages. No other capitalist country has ever done that. You produced in the United States, therefore, a bizarre culture and mentality. It had to do with the following. One, there is something absolutely unique about the United States. Not the story I just told, but something else. If you're religious, then God loves America, especially. Well, you do know that every politician who runs for office, you can see them on TV now, has to say that over and over again. It's a mantra. Well, that's not just a peculiarity of Rick Perry or something. That's our culture. There's something unique and special about the United States. We are a country in which if you work hard, you do well and you do better over time. And your children will live better than you and your grandchildren still better and all of that. It becomes part of our national culture. We are different from, we are superior to. Again, every politician has to say, greatest country on earth. What an obnoxious behavior. But you'd have to explain, since we all kind of understand that that's obnoxious. There's a wonderful line by that comedian Louis Black who plays a riff on this where he explains, can you imagine working in an office where somebody comes in and keeps telling you how they're the greatest thing on earth? You know, your instinct would be to push them out the window. You know, it'd be unbearable. Why does the United States do that? It is obnoxious. If you ever go to Europe and talk to people who are honest, they'll tell you how obnoxious it is. Well, it's part of our history. It's our culture. There is something unique about the United States. It did pay higher wages for 150 years, every decade, even across the Great Depression, it's true. In those years, the wages went down, but the prices went down more, so they ended up with more wages. The thing I want to hammer home to you is, it's over. It's been over since the 1970s. In the 1970s, the labor shortage of the United States stopped. Now that's a trauma in a culture. I use the word trauma advisedly. I'm married to a psychotherapist. She's taught me what trauma means, and it's the word I want. Culture goes through a trauma. Consciousness goes through a trauma. The era of working hard and doing better, finished. There's no labor shortage. Americans didn't get paid well because they worked hard. They get paid well because there weren't enough of them. Hard as it is to accept that. But it means that when there are enough, you can work as hard as you want. You're not going to do better. You're going to do worse. Why did that happen in the 1970s? Because the world economy shifted. The very world economy that created this peculiar capitalism in the United States now shifted. What was it? Very simply, the computer removes vast numbers of people needed for work. Instead of 50 people in a supermarket keeping track of how many rolls of toilet paper we buy, we do a little scanning moment at the end when we check out. And one person looking at a computer in Boise, Idaho, can tell you exactly how many rolls of toilet paper have to be ordered by a supermarket in Brooklyn tomorrow. Number two, the United States, because it had paid higher wages, by the 1970s, had created, because that's how capitalism works, an immense incentive for American companies to look elsewhere for cheaper workers whose wages hadn't risen for 150 years. And there are lots of places that are eager to be candidates. So between the computer, which reduced the number of people we needed, and the export of jobs elsewhere, which reduced the number of Americans we needed to give jobs to, the shortage of labor was no longer a problem. And as if that weren't enough, we had two other phenomena. We had a very important historical movement. A vast new labor force entered the workplace looking for work just as the jobs shrank. The name of that labor force? Adult women, who, because of the women's liberation movement and several other things, moved into the labor force looking for work, real work. Not a part-time job here or there, not the pin money story, a real job. And we had the latest wave of immigration. This was not from Europe, from Latin America, basically. So you put together the women and the immigrants and the reduction of jobs because of computers and export of employment, end of labor shortage. And every employer in America knows, whether he or she has gone to business school or not, that the first rule of capitalism is, if you don't have to pay your workers anymore, don't do it. That's a smart move in the world of capitalism. That shows you're a sharp student of how the system works. Don't pay workers more if you don't have to. For 150 years, employers had to, for the reasons I gave you. Starting in the 1970s, didn't have to anymore. So guess what? They didn't. The real wages of the United States in 1970 stopped rising, and they have never resumed. The real wage of an American worker today, the average amount of money adjusted for the prices in 2011, is what it was in 1978. Very important you understand that. Not a statistic you'll see real often in the newspaper, but it comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics in Washington, the official source for all these numbers. So there's no secret I'm telling you here. Any economist with minimum training has learned how to look at those BLS numbers, and there they are. So how did the American people handle this trauma? Badly. Because the trauma was never articulated. Again, my psychotherapist wife, if you want to get through a trauma, you got to face it. You know, like if you go to an AA meeting, you begin, I have a problem, that's why I'm here. Well, you'd have to have had a culture that faced the problem. There had to be a culture in the 70s that said, hey, we're at a turning point in our culture. There's no more rising wages and not likely to be any. We had nothing of the sort. We're so busy being the greatest country on earth, we needed to pretend that nothing was going on. Which meant that every American working class family had to face this crisis without information about why it was happening, without an understanding of it as a social problem. And so they handle it as an individual issue. In case you haven't figured that out in life, you cannot solve social problems with individual actions. That's a mirage. Gets you into a lot of trouble. Here's how the American working class reacted to the trauma of change by individual actions. Two in the main. One, Americans began to do more work. You know, if you don't get more per hour, do more hours. And here's what the American family did. If the husband was working, he took a second job, maybe even a third one. The women, well, I've already told you, they had to go out and work. The teenagers began to discover the importance of after school and weekends, and the old people came out of retirement. OECD, a major international organization, statistic for you to think about. Americans do more hours of paid labor per year than any other working class in any advanced industrial country, including Japan. We work ourselves to death. No one does that. So the first reaction of the American family was to work, and above all to send mother out. Since mother had held together the emotional life of the American family, now she's as exhausted as papa, and everybody's working and getting on everyone's nerves. We've had 30, 40 years of disintegration of the family, not because of abortion. We've had disintegration of the family because we put our families under a level of stress and pressure that is unsupportable. And here's the irony. The coalition of Republicans and Democrats who pushed through all the steps necessary to have all this happen, to allow computers to be replacing people without limit, to allow corporations to move abroad without limit, to bring in the immigrants and all the rest. They then took no responsibility for any of this. Worse, one of the two parties figured out that since they were busy destroying the family, that would probably generate a nostalgia for the family, and one of the parties figured out how to use that to stay in power. That's called the Republican Party, which invented family values, that wonderful human tendency to celebrate with great intensity that which is no longer around, in the vain idea that if you support this party, it'll come back. Brilliant politics. What is the second thing the American working class did in the last 30 years to try to cope with the trauma of no more rising wages? Well, here's the problem. We'd all promised our children the American dream. We had kind of fancied we'd get it for ourselves. Nice home, nice car, nice clothes, nice vacation. You know the routine. Send the kids to school. With flat wages, that's no longer possible. So you work more hours. I've been through that with you. What's the second thing? You borrow money like there's no tomorrow. In the last 30 years, the American working class became a pioneer in a new way, not crossing the great continent, but by borrowing money no working class in history had ever borrowed before. So by 2007, guess what? Our working class is physically exhausted, emotionally stressed beyond words by the collapse of the family, and now into debt way over their head, because it doesn't take a genius, and it sure doesn't take a PhD in economics to know that if the debts keep rising for 30 years, but the wages that have to pay for it in the end are flat, there will come a day, certain, when you can't cover your debts anymore. And 2007, that's what happened. And so we have a crisis that didn't behave like the other capitalist crises. You know, capitalism is an extraordinarily unstable system, always has been. But periodically, it has crises that are very deep, because it's not just your up and down, it's a society that has reached a point where it can't continue. That's where we are. That's why this crisis went down in 2007, and President Bush said it would be over soon. And then we had Obama, and he said it would be over soon. We're now the 5th year. It officially started in September of 2007. We're now December 2011, beginning the 5th year of this crisis, and there is no end in sight. Unless you think this is unusual for capitalism, it isn't. The Great Depression begins in 1929 and lasts until 1940-41, long time. The Great Depression that hit Japan in 1989 is still going on. So the idea that they always have to be short, wishful thinking. This is not a short one. This is already one of the longest we've had. And as I say, there's no end in sight. Okay. If I had time, I'd talk to you about how the bad news for the working class, the vast majority, has been spectacularly good news for the other side, the employers. So let me do real summary with you. If for 30 years the wages are flat, it's basically what we've had. And if over the same time the productivity of workers has risen every year a little bit, productivity simply measures how much stuff per hour is produced per worker. How many hamburgers, how many shirts, how many computer programs, or whatever. So the productivity goes up over the last 30 years. The wages are flat. Real simple economics. Wages is what the employer gives the employee. Productivity is what the employee gives the employer. So let's review. What the employer gives the employee is flat. What the employee gives the employer keeps going up. That's why we've had 30 years of prosperity. That's why over the last 30 years the United States has become a much more unequal society, because the mass of people got themselves into debt, while a tiny number of people, those around the employing class, did spectacularly well. Stock market runs like we've never seen before. And if I had more time, I'd explain to you that when the American working class went into debt over the last 30 years, if you think about it, you might have had in your mind the flashing question, where'd the money come from to give them those loans? And the answer is, the extra profit the employers got because they didn't pay workers rising wages was taken by them and lent back to the American working class. For the employers, it meant instead of paying workers rising wages for this last generation, the way we've done for the previous 150 years, we've got a new kind of capitalism. We don't increase their wages. We drive them into debt. They're going to have to borrow for the weekly groceries. They're going to have to borrow to send their kid to college. They're going to have to borrow for everything. And they're going to be in hock forever. And if I had more time, I'd stop now and I'd play the national anthem. But we're pressured for time, so I will continue. Not only did the employers reap unbelievable profits, but like employers in capitalism always do, when excited by profits, they developed a mythology about why they were there. Quickly now. Mythology number one. This is not about not paying workers' wages increases anymore, because what kind of an achievement would that be to boast about? No. So we began in the 1970s, when this began, by developing the mythology of the genius entrepreneur. We learned names like Lee Iacocca and Jack Welch. Some of you will remember. Iacocca from Chrysler, Welch from GE. Books were written about. You saw them on television. Suddenly we were supposed to believe these people had become geniuses. Implication, they were morons before, but suddenly they became geniuses. And the reason these companies were making a great deal of money was they were so terribly smart. The stupidity of this is beyond words, but there is a method to the madness. Because what? If the reason that companies are making money is not because they're sticking it to their workers, which was the truth, but rather it's the genius of the top executives, then the logical follow point would be you ought to pay them for what they are achieving. So starting in the 1970s, we start paying our executives wild amounts of money. American executives are paid much more than their counterparts in Europe or Japan. So this has nothing to do with capitalism per se. That's the mythology here. This has to do with a peculiar moment of our history, which the executives have been grabbing ever since. 2 years ago, when the crisis hit, we all became upset about Goldman Sachs. And I'm glad. It's just 30 years late. Corporations have been stealing that money by their executives. Second thing they did, they developed fancy new instruments to make even more money by trading obligations, derivatives, asset-backed securities, all that stuff. And as always has happened in capitalism, they went crazy in their speculation. So by 2007, they had created a mountain of these new instruments, all of which had a particular thing in common. They were all new financial instruments based on the debts of the working class. Asset-backed securities means a security that isn't a share of a company making something. It's a share of a debt obligation in the society. Mortgage debt, credit card debt, car payment debt, college student debt. All of those things have been made into securities that are bought and sold by the trillions around the world. But they all depend on the ability of the underlying working class to pay back. But you created the impossibility for them to do that. And by 2007, the explosion happened. The speculations collapsed because they were premised on a working class whose debt level was unsustainable. It is a wonderful example the next time someone tells you about the efficiency of the capitalist system. There's not a story of efficiency. This is a story of unmitigated disaster. And the system that wants us to celebrate it when it is delivering the goods has to stand there and take it when it's delivering the bads, one after another, year after year. Otherwise, the claims to efficiency are hollow. Let me bring this to a close. We've been here before. This is not the first time. The last time, and the only relevant example to really use these days, is the Great Depression of the 1930s, when unemployment was greater than we've had it, at least so far, in this one. Bank failures very similar to this one. And what happened? Two things, two big lessons. Number one, we had a radical shift in the government's policy. Franklin Roosevelt was elected as a balanced budget Democrat, a centrist, we might call him today. Nobody with a program to deal with the Great Depression, even though that's what elected him. Should sound familiar to you. So now he's the president, but he's a president at a different time. By 1933 and 4, he's barely in there for a while. The level of unemployment reaches 25%, 2.5 times what we have now, or better than that. Terrible. And the demand for him to change policy and do something is loud. But a demand that's loud is one thing. A demand that's organized and loud, that's very different. And there were 3 organizations in the 1930s that made all the difference. One, the biggest surge in labor movement in American history. We've never had anything before like it. We've never had anything since. It was called the CIO, Congress of Industrial Organizations. Swept across the major industries, auto, steel, rubber, chemicals, all of that. Suddenly there were millions of workers, joining unions and demanding that the government deal with the suffering of the mass of the working class. We also had very strong, powerful, and influential socialist and communist parties in those years. And together with the labor movement, in which they were the activists, they made the noise deafening, and Mr. Roosevelt shifted gear, big time. He went to his own people. Roosevelt came from one of the oldest, richest, best connected families you could come from in the United States. People who had already been president. He went to them and he split them down the middle. He gave them a simple message. He said, hey, I have to do something for the mass of people, because if not, this system isn't going to be here much longer. So you better give me money, lots of it, your money, your wealth, your income. You got to give it to me so that I can take care of the mass of people. Because if you don't, coming down the road behind me are the CIO, the communists, and the socialists, and they're going to cut you a lot less attractive deal than I'll give you. And he split them. And so suddenly, they gave him money. I'm going to explain it to you in a minute because the numbers are stupefying. They gave him the money. So in the midst of a depression, much worse than today, instead of hearing, there's no money for people, there's no money to help people, the way we're hearing it now, the depression much worse. Here's what they did in the middle of the 1930s, the depths of the depression. They found the money to create, for the first time in the United States, an old age retirement program called Social Security. We didn't have that before. Suddenly the money was there to say to everybody over 65, here's a lot of money, forever, as long as you live. What? Yes, but that was only the beginning. Number two, we created the unemployment compensation system. Before that, if you were unemployed, tough. Go to church. Beg. Beg. Suddenly, if you were fired for no fault of your own because the company couldn't sell its output so they didn't need you, okay, the government gives you money for many, many weeks. There was no money. Of course there was money. But the best, in 1934, Roosevelt goes on the radio, makes a speech to the American people. If the private sector, I'll do the best I can, if the private sector cannot or will not hire the millions of Americans who want to work, then there's no alternative but for the government to do it. Between 1934 and 1941, Roosevelt created and filled more than 12 million jobs. There was no money. Sure there was. The money was there because there was pressure from below that said, you better find it quick, or you're going to be history. And guess what? They found it. Here's where they found it. By 1942, here's the way the taxes in America worked. For every dollar that Washington got by taxing individual incomes, it got $1.50 by taxing corporate income. In other words, corporations as a group paid 50% more to Washington than the individuals. What's the relationship today? For every dollar that individuals pay to Washington, it collects from the corporations taken together 25 cents. Welcome to America. Over the last 50 years, we've had a shift of the burden of taxation from corporations to individuals. It's not that we in America are too highly taxed. You are too highly taxed, and I've just told you who isn't, but that's only half the story. Let's take a look at individuals. In 1950s and 60s, 40s, 50s, and for those 3 decades, what was the income tax bracket of the highest, the richest Americans? You ready? 91%. Let me explain what that means. For a rich person, every dollar over $100,000 that you earned, you had to give 91 cents to Washington. You got to keep 9. What is the tax bracket on the richest Americans today? 35%. From 91 to 35. That's a tax cut. So we not only shifted the burden of taxes from corporations to individuals, we shifted it from the richest to everybody else. Hard times for the working class. But not for the other people. Not at all. It's not that there's a shortage of money. It's that we have a government that will not tax corporations and the rich, not in the way of some fantastic socialist demand. We won't even do it the way we used to do it in the United States when we had a government of Republicans and Democrats both, because they both endorsed those tax rates. Not just Truman, also Eisenhower. Not just the Democratic Congresses, Republicans. They did it, and you know why? Because we had just been through a Great Depression, and we were going through, or had just been